What's up, guys? Welcome back to Newswave. So yesterday we had talked about all of the speculation and rumors going on for Nintendo Switch Online, potentially adding two other systems, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Nintendo 64. However, we did have a listing that went live and was spotted yesterday from Nintendo with the FCC that appears to be pointing to a new controller heading to the Switch, and this has started to ramp up speculation once again around Nintendo 64, and we're going to go over that one here today. Also, we are going to be talking about that PlayStation 5 controversy around the new PS5 revision, as it appears that's been put to rest, and we're also going to talk about SEGA, who is heading to Tokyo Game Show, apparently with a new RPG. Guys, if you enjoy these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton. And if you're new here to the Spawnwave channel, make sure you subscribe down below and ring that notification bell so you can keep up to date with all the uploads here on the channel. And we're going to start today with Tales of Arise, just released last week, and looks like it's off to a very fast start. We can see this was tweeted out by their official account saying, Tales of Arise tops 1 million at the fastest speed in the history of the series, and they have a nice commemorative illustration there to celebrate the occasion, and that was pretty fast. I mean, getting to 1 million units sold, that's digital and physical, of course, added together, it is pretty good overall for the Tales series to be done within its first week on the market. Now, it also released to a lot of platforms, basically everything but the Switch, and I do think it will go to the Switch at some point, which will, of course, work to just add on to their overall sales total. But we saw when it released on Steam, the initial player count was higher than all the other Tales games that had launched on Steam combined. So certainly the extra development work they put into this, even though they had to delay it, and then, of course, making that shift over to Unreal Engine seems to have paid off here. So good news for the Tales series going forward. Also, we had a nice surprise the other day, as it looks like later on tonight, you'll be able to download Deltarune Chapter 2. Now, if you're not aware, Deltarune was released by Toby Fox, who's the creator of Undertale, and he said this was like a game that kind of came to him in a dream back in 2011, and he's been working on it for a while, and he's kind of just been releasing them as he is able to. And yes, it's been 3 years since the first Deltarune Chapter 1 released in 2018, eventually made its way to the Switch and the PlayStation 4. However, Deltarune Chapter 2, at least for now, will be releasing later on tonight. They have this entire website set up with a countdown to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It's going to be on PC and Mac, and it looked like they had just kind of like revealed this at the end of an Undertale live stream that I believe was celebrating its 6th anniversary. I mean, Deltarune itself obviously plays off of like Undertale with kind of the setup for it and the fact that it's like an RPG, but it did some very interesting things in general with the RPG genre, and I think it's definitely worth checking out, especially ahead of this release, as I'm sure you'll probably need a refresher anyway. Kind of came out of nowhere. Like I said, it's been 3 years since Chapter 1 released, but I am looking forward to checking this one out over the weekend. Oh, and we had just talked about Famitsu's review for Lost Judgment, putting it above Sonic Forces, so far so good there, but we did have overall reviews go live yesterday, and we can see this over on Metacritic, sitting at an 83 currently, and we can see the split overall with 38 positive and 6 mixed. Now, I was looking through some of the reviews, and people did seem kind of disappointed, maybe what they were expecting from this new game in the Judgement series that very well could end up being the last, depending on how things go with that talent agency and SEGA and all of this. But the biggest thing people were pointing towards was more or less the pacing and maybe the story itself being kind of zany at times, not just really lining up with what they thought they were going to get out of this new entry in the Judgement series. I'm looking forward to checking it out. It's out next week, and I'll be picking it up to see what it's all about, and I'm sure we'll talk with Max, who did his own review on his Dreamcast Guy channel about it during the podcast that week. And guys, with some of the quick news out of the way, let's get into the bigger stuff. Let's start right away with this new controller that was spotted through an FCC filing, where they're essentially testing all like the radio frequency waves, all of these different things in a test environment to make sure it's up to standard and they're able to actually sell it. Well, it does appear that this controller could fall in line with things that we've seen from that NES controller that we had released and that Super Nintendo controller that we had released. This one being HAC-043, lines up with HAC-042, which was the Super Nintendo controller, and the Nintendo controller was 033. So a little off there, but either way, it does appear to be falling in line with what people would expect a Nintendo 64 controller, I guess, to be. And I would like to see Nintendo take a shot at a 64 controller now in like 2021 or in 2022, if that's when we do see, say, the 64 games go to Nintendo Switch Online service. However, you can see the filing here that even shows a diagram of the figure itself. Specifically, they have to show where the label is going to go on the device, the controller. It is described as a controller, and this is where things are kind of funny because it's throwing people off, as it just shows a square. Like it's just a rectangle, or I guess a square here for it. It shows that the label will be going on the top and then on the back. So obviously, this doesn't look like a Nintendo 64 controller. However, there is kind of a confidentiality agreement, one being more short-term, that will be in place for at least the next 6 months or so. It appears that it'll be up in March of next year. However, that's generally in place until Nintendo has like their actual announcement of whatever this is. And honestly, that announcement come at any time, as people are expecting, or at least anticipating, some sort of direct or some sort of event from Nintendo here coming up. For example, if you look at how the NES controller was with the label location, it was also just kind of a square. Now, I mean, that's kind of what the NES controller was shaped like anyway, but still it doesn't have like the Joy-Con rail or any markings otherwise on there. It's a very crude figure of where the label is going to be, essentially. And looking at the Nintendo 64 controller, people point out, yeah, there's a label on the top of it, kind of like in the plastic molding. I don't know if that's necessarily confirmation that that is what this figure would end up becoming, a Nintendo 64 controller. They're not just going to put a silhouette of a Nintendo 64 controller there and be like, all right, guys, keep this one quiet. It's definitely not the Nintendo 64 controller, even though that's like completely what it's shaped as. So they're just showing a brick or a block, just like, okay, the label's going to kind of be on the back and then sort of on the top. Although this could also be maybe a Wii Fit board. Maybe we're going to get Wii Fit 2 or something for the Switch, and they just leave Wii in the title because it worked so well before. I mean, honestly, this could be anything. I know we're looking at it and saying, well, the rumors for the 64 games heading to the Switch Online are out there, and this is like right in line with the model number for the Super Nintendo controller. It's got to be that 64 controller, but Nintendo, like I said before, they liked Nintendo, so it could legitimately be anything. It could be, like I said, a Wii Fit board. It could be a stand for the Virtual Boy, so you get that nice experience. Maybe it's some controller that lets you slide the Switch in to like a little handheld controller and it turns it into a Game Boy. There's a lot of possibilities here, so I guess we'll find out at least in the next 6 months. I think it's going to be sooner than that. However, as again, there are a lot of rumors and speculation going on right now with Nintendo potentially adding a new system to that online service here coming up pretty soon. Next up, let's talk about the whole PlayStation 5 controversy that really revolved around a revision for the PS5. Essentially, Austin Evans took one apart, found that the heatsink inside was smaller than the original PlayStation 5, and it was also missing a lot of the copper, and essentially looked like they had removed quite a bit of material from the heatsink that led to an immediate conclusion that it was just outright worse. But the thing I was really waiting for was actual data around temperatures inside of the system. I wasn't even really thinking about games and how well they would run on the newer PS5, although I guess if it was throttling internally, you would get worse frame rates. But that didn't stop Digital Foundry and Gamers Nexus from trying it all out, that being in games, and Gamers Nexus really just attaching a ton of probes to the system to figure out how it performed in terms of those internal temperatures, not just the exhaust temperature. Anyway, you can see Digital Foundry posted up an entire article and Gamers Nexus posted up an entire video alongside of them going over all the aspects of this new PS5 revision. And I think the headline pretty much tells you all you need to know immediately from Eurogamer, where they say PlayStation 5 CFI 1100 review, better or worse than the launch console, following up saying Sony's revised model is reassuringly non-controversial. And looking through a lot of the results that they were able to gather, that being Eurogamer and Gamers Nexus, yeah, it's essentially the same. I know the material inside, sure, it's less when it comes to the heatsink. However, it does appear that Sony did do work in R&D to make sure it was basically the same when it came to temperatures. In fact, Gamers Nexus actually found the temperatures were lower on one of the most concerning parts around that original PS5, and that has to do with the memory that was located on the board. Those RAM modules would get extremely hot inside of the PS5, and it appears that, I don't know if it's the different, maybe the mold or punching that they did around that metal shell or that cage that goes around the motherboard, but it appears that that has actually worked to lower temperatures on those RAM modules. However, it does appear that the SoC itself is like a degree or two higher than the original. So you kind of have a trade-off here, but to be honest, a lot of what they showed was very close to being margin of error. Basically, it's pretty much the same. And to go along with that, Eurogamer and Digital Foundry didn't really find much when it came to like frame rate differences or any of that could result from throttling. So really, there's no concerns, I would say, around this new revised PlayStation 5. And hey, I mean, we've seen scalpers, if you look online, resellers are listing original PS5, first edition PS5, because they're trying to play into it, but I wouldn't be too concerned about any of that. It's already hard enough to find a PS5 as it is. Now we're throwing original PS5 into the mix. No, it just seems pretty straightforward. Sony did their homework around this new design, and it just appears that it's business as usual for this new PlayStation revision, really not having much difference at all, other than it being lighter and I guess having an easier job kind of screwing that stand in. That's kind of about it. Next up, let's talk about the Famitsu sales charts. Now, this gives us an idea as to how games and hardware are selling week to week in Japan, and we can start over here with the top 10, where we see right at the top, Tales of Arise, that being on the PlayStation 4, 151,316 copies. That's pretty good considering there's also a PlayStation 5 version of Tales of Arise that sold 50,482, pushing the series over 200,000 copies, debuting here physically in Japan last week. That's very good to see that for the Tales series. Of course, we just talked about how it's already crossed 1 million units within its first week. Then we see WarioWare get it together there at number 2, 72,277. Seems about right. I would say average for the series overall. Ring Fit Adventure there at 4. Then we have Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Minecraft, Momotaro, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Ys 9 debuting on the Switch there at 7,324 copies, and then Pokemon Sword and Shield rounding out the top 10. Moving over to the hardware, the Nintendo Switch is at the top, 67,114. You know, I'm a little surprised the Switch continues to sell as well as it is right now in Japan. Considering the OLED model is like 3 weeks away or something, you feel like the sales numbers would drop off a bit more as people are just kind of hanging out, saving their money for that, but nope, still is just rolling along there. PlayStation 5, 16,975. Didn't really have much of a spike in terms of hardware sales from Tales of Arise, mostly because it appears the PS5 is still supply constrained pretty well in Japan. The Xbox Series, just over 2,000 systems sold. You know what's interesting about that is it's coming up to the Xbox One's lifetime sales here very quickly. The Xbox Series may cross, I think it will. I think it's going to cross 100,000 units overall here in the next month or two. So we'll keep an eye on that one. And then we have the PlayStation 4, 1,763. And then the 3DS, people are still finding these, I guess, in the back room of some of these stores, 789. But overall, once again, a pretty good opening week for Tales of Arise. We just talked about them selling 1 million units within its first week, and looks like a large chunk were sold here in Japan. Over 200,000 copies between the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5. We haven't really seen a lot of PlayStation software in the top 10 for the Famitsu sales charts. Usually it's like Switch games, you know, 1 through 10, and that's generally it. So it just shows how strong Tales has been out of the gate so far. I'm kind of curious how it will do over time, because this seems to be lining up to have, I guess, the best sales overall for a Tales game, especially since we kind of assume it's going to be heading to the Switch later on at some point, where it will boost sales there once again. WarioWare seems about average, kind of falling in line with the WarioWare series in general, but obviously the big star here when it comes to sales was Tales of Arise, and we'll keep an eye on it as we go along. And in our last bit of news, let's talk about SEGA at Tokyo Game Show. Now, Tokyo Game Show is like right at the end of September going into the first week of October. I believe it's the 30th of September running through the 3rd of October, but there is an entire schedule posted up online for all of the different companies attending. That's like Square, we have Microsoft, Konami, and SEGA. But if we take a look at what SEGA has listed here, they say we are also planning to announce SEGA's new RPG, and obviously, people are excited for this, similar to how Sean was excited when there was going to be a new AAA Knights game that was going to be announced, and then it just ended up being Humankind. Although people seem to really like Humankind, so I guess that worked out for SEGA on that front. But it was not the AAA Knights game that Sean was hoping for, so it's SEGA. I'm not necessarily ready to jump out there and say, oh, Skies of Arcadia is finally getting that sequel. No, what this most likely will be is a new entry in the Sakura Wars series, as a logo did accidentally go live, apparently, on Sega's website for this. I would also look towards Atlas, maybe at this event for Tokyo Game Show, as they will maybe have some sort of announcement for that, I don't know, like year-long celebration for their anniversary. It's interesting way to go about that, one announcement every month, but this seems like a good place to have maybe a bigger announcement around that. Either way though, look towards Tokyo Game Show for hopefully some good announcements from some of these bigger companies like Square, Microsoft, and hopefully SEGA with an interesting new RPG ready to show. And before we go to the comment of the day, we're taking a look at the poll that I posted up yesterday, where I asked GameCube or Nintendo 64. 70% of you said GameCube, that is the correct answer, and then 30% of you must have accidentally clicked on Nintendo 64. But I mean, really looking at this, GameCube's gonna age better for a lot of people. If you look at the 64 now and some of the frame rates and textures, and it's not the greatest. So I get why people now would be able to go back to the GameCube and have a more enjoyable experience, even though we did have GoldenEye and Perfect Dark back in the day. You try to play those now, it's tough. Whereas then you try to play something on the GameCube that may be running at 60 frames per second, and it's probably a lot more enjoyable, especially since we have those HDMI adapters now that you can plug into the back of your GameCube, and they just look overall better because obviously we were a generation ahead then. And we'll finish up with the comment of the day as you're seeing here. This is from Jim saying, why wait this long to activate Bluetooth? I'm glad it's working, but I don't know why it took this many years. Okay, so we're gonna attempt to make sense of Nintendo, which is probably a losing effort on its own. But if we think about how Nintendo launched the Switch, it was missing, really, it was even more featureless than it is now. I mean, it was very bare bones then. They have added some stuff on, but I assume when Nintendo released the Switch, they weren't really thinking about a more personalized experience with the system, which is what you would get out of using like Bluetooth headphones or something like you would with the Switch Lite. Nintendo was more or less thinking of a community system, one that you would pass a Joy-Con off, and it would be a bit odd to not share sound with someone necessarily. And there were some limitations that were put in place along with those the Bluetooth audio that you can sync up, as you are limited to a certain number of controllers, and some things even in the options around grip and controllers is like marked off. So that's the best guess I can give you. Why it took 4 years, who knows? It's Nintendo. And ladies and gentlemen, that's gonna do it here for Newswave. If you enjoyed this video, guys, hit that like button, it really helps out. If not, hit the dislike. Leave comments down below about everything we talked about here today. Where's this mysterious controller listing that's popped up with the FCC and Nintendo? What do you think they're planning here? Is it a new Wii Fit board, or is it that Nintendo 64 controller to go along with Nintendo Switch Online? Also, what about this whole situation around the PS5 controversy and this new system? You think we can finally put that to rest with actual numbers and testing being done here? And then what do you think that new RPG that SEGA is gonna have to show at Tokyo Game Show later on this month? Thanks guys for watching. Have a great weekend. I'll see you back here Monday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern time for Newswave.